Somewhere in the French countryside, June 1944, a German reconnaissance pilot banks his Focke-Wulf over a hedgerow and spots them. American tanks, dozens of them. Shermans lined in perfect formation beneath camouflage netting, their long guns pointed east toward the Rhine. He scribbles coordinates, banks hard, and races back to report the sighting. Within hours, Wehrmacht commanders redirect 2 panzer divisions to counter the threat. But there are no tanks. There never were. What the pilots saw, what the German High Command believed, was painted canvas and inflated rubber. The tanks weighed 60 pounds each. They could be carried by 4 men. And the soldiers who manned them weren't armored cavalry. They were artists. Welcome to the Ghost Army, the most unusual unit in American military history. 1,000 men who fought the Third Reich not with bullets, but with brushes and bullhorns, and the oldest weapon of all, illusion. Their story remained classified for more than 40 years after the war ended. When the truth finally emerged, it seemed too bizarre to be real. But every deception, every inflatable tank, every sound effect broadcast across no man's land, all of it happened, and it saved thousands of lives. The idea was born in desperation. By 1943, Allied planners faced an impossible equation. They were preparing to invade Europe, but German intelligence was good, very good. Every troop movement, every supply depot, every tank column, the Nazis were watching, tracking, calculating. The Allies needed to be in multiple places at once. They needed divisions that didn't exist, armies that were ghosts. Enter Colonel Billy Harris and Colonel Clifford Simonson, 2 officers tasked with an assignment that sounded more like science fiction than warfare. Create a unit capable of impersonating entire divisions. Make the Germans see what isn't there. They turned to an unlikely recruiting pool: art schools, advertising agencies, theater companies, radio stations. The call went out quietly through selective service channels. Men with talent in deception, design, and drama. Painters who understood perspective and shadow. Sound engineers who could manipulate audio. Actors who could inhabit a role completely. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was activated in January 1944 at Camp Forest, Tennessee. On paper, they were a standard signal unit. In reality, they were something that had never existed before. Among the first to arrive was Private Jack Macy, a young designer from New York. He'd expected to spend the war drafting propaganda posters. Instead, he found himself learning to set up fake radio networks and inflate rubber tanks the size of locomotives. We thought it was a joke at first. They showed us these deflated tanks in a warehouse and told us we'd be using them to trick Hitler. I looked at the sergeant like he'd lost his mind. But Macy stayed. They all did. Because alongside him were men like Ellsworth Kelly, who would become one of America's most celebrated abstract painters, Bill Blass, future fashion icon, Art Kane, legendary photographer, actors, sculptors, designers, men whose names would define American culture in the decades after the war. But in 1944, they were soldiers, and their canvas was the battlefield. The training was unlike anything the Army had ever attempted. They learned to drive Sherman tanks, the real ones, so they could understand how armor moved, how it sounded, how crews behaved. Then they practiced with the inflatables, massive rubber constructs that required air compressors and careful staging to look convincing from the air. They studied German reconnaissance patterns, photo interpretation, the physics of shadows and how they changed with the angle of the sun.
The sonic deception unit learned to record battlefield sounds, tanks moving, troops assembling, supply trucks rumbling, then play them back through massive speakers mounted on half-tracks. The recordings weren't just loud, they were precise, engineered to carry for miles, to be picked up by German listening posts and sound ranging equipment. The special effects unit built dummy artillery from wood and paint. From 500 feet up, through the haze of distance, they were indistinguishable from the real thing.
The radio deception unit, the spook operators, learned to mimic the transmission patterns of actual divisions. Every unit in the Army had a radio signature, a rhythm and pattern to how they communicated. The spooks studied these patterns until they could impersonate an entire armored division with just a few radios and a lot of nerve. By May 1944, they were ready. They landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day +18. The beach was still a nightmare of wrecked landing craft and shell craters. The sound of artillery rolled down from the hedgerows. Private Arthur Shillstone, an illustrator from Connecticut, stepped off the landing craft and immediately started sketching. Not out of artistic impulse, he was documenting vehicle spacing, camouflage patterns, the way real units positioned themselves in the Norman countryside. Everything was reference material, he said years later. We were going to have to sell this, and if we got one detail wrong, if a German pilot saw something that didn't match, people would die. Their first operation came in mid-June as part of Operation Elephant. The real 2nd Armored Division was moving south to support the breakout from the beachhead. The Ghost Army's job was to make the Germans think the 2nd Armored was still in position near the coast. They set up camp at night, exactly where the 2nd Armored had been. By dawn, the inflatable tanks were positioned, camouflage netting in place, dummy artillery pointing skyward. The sonic units played recordings of tank maintenance, the clank of treads being repaired, the whine of generators, men shouting orders. The radio unit broadcast on the 2nd Armored's frequencies, mimicking their call signs and message traffic. From above, from German observation posts, it looked and sounded like a full armored division settling in for the long haul. Meanwhile, the real 2nd Armored was already 30 miles south, cutting through German defenses that had been stripped to counter the threat on the coast. The deception held for 3 days. By the time German intelligence realized the mistake, the actual offensive was already underway. Entire Wehrmacht units had been positioned to counter a phantom force. The Ghost Army had drawn its first blood without firing a shot. But the work was more than just dangerous. It was absurd. Picture it. Private First Class Ned Harris, a painter who'd studied at the Art Students League, crouching beside an inflatable Sherman at 3 a.m., using a paintbrush to add mud, actually pigmented latex, to the fake treads, making sure the weathering looked authentic, that the rubber tank had the same grimy, war-worn appearance as the real ones. Picture Sergeant George Vandersloot, a sound engineer from Chicago, hauling 500-pound speakers through French farmland, setting them up a quarter mile from German lines, then playing recordings of tank columns at ear-splitting volume. Knowing that if the Germans figured out what he was doing, every artillery piece in range would zero in on his position. Picture the notional units, the men who would walk around fake camps wearing the patches and insignia of divisions that weren't there. Going into local towns, talking loudly in bars about their unit and where they were headed, dropping false information that they knew would reach German intelligence within hours. It was theater, deadly serious theater, where a bad performance meant men died. And it worked. Operation Brest, September 1944. The Ghost Army impersonated the 6th Armored Division, creating the illusion of a major force threatening the heavily fortified port city. The Germans reinforced Brest with units pulled from other sectors. Meanwhile, the actual Allied advance bypassed Brest entirely, racing east toward Germany with weakened opposition. Operation Wiltz, October 1944. The Ghost Army set up a massive fake supply depot in Luxembourg, complete with inflatable trucks, fake fuel dumps, and radio traffic suggesting a major logistics hub.
German bombers attacked it repeatedly, wasting ordnance on rubber and wood, while actual supply lines remained untouched. Each operation followed the same pattern: reconnaissance, setup, performance, then a rapid exit before anyone could get close enough to see through the illusion. Because if the Germans ever captured one of these inflatable tanks, if they ever got close enough to realize what they were fighting, the entire deception would collapse. The Ghost Army operated on the razor's edge between brilliant strategy and catastrophic failure. Staff Sergeant Harold Dahl, a designer who'd worked in advertising before the war, described the constant tension. You'd be out there at night inflating a Sherman, and you'd hear German patrols moving through the woods a few hundred yards away. You're working with air compressors that sound like freight trains. You're waiting for the artillery to start landing. And you can't run, because if you don't finish the setup, the whole deception falls apart. They took casualties. Not many. Their survival rate was far better than infantry units, but enough. Men killed by random artillery fire, by mines, by German patrols who stumbled on setup operations. Private Robert Tompkins, an actor from Philadelphia, was killed in November 1944 when a German reconnaissance plane strafed what it thought was a real supply convoy. The jeep with dummy supply crates Tompkins was driving didn't look any different to the pilot until he was already firing.
The Ghost Army erected no monuments to their dead. They couldn't. Their mission was still classified. The men who died did so anonymously, buried with cover stories about Signal Corps operations. Their families never knew the truth. By December 1944, the Ghost Army had conducted 15 major operations. They had impersonated more than a dozen different divisions. They had diverted German resources, protected actual troop movements, and contributed to breakthroughs across the European theater. And then came the bulge. Hitler's desperate winter offensive caught the Allies completely off guard. German forces smashed through the Ardennes, creating a massive salient in the Allied lines. For weeks, the outcome hung in balance. The Ghost Army was thrown into the chaos. In late December, they were ordered to impersonate the 75th Infantry Division near Trier, Germany, creating the illusion of a major force that might threaten the southern flank of the German offensive. It was the most dangerous operation they'd attempted. The Germans were advancing. Lines were fluid. The Ghost Army found themselves setting up fake positions, sometimes less than a mile from actual German units. Sergeant Victor Dowd, who would later become a famous artist, remembered those weeks with crystalline clarity. It was madness. We'd set up at night, do our performance during the day, then pack up and retreat before we got overrun. The Germans were everywhere. We could hear their tanks, see their reconnaissance flights, and we're out there with rubber and paint, pretending to be a real division. The cold was murderous. The inflatable tanks became rigid in the freezing temperatures, harder to deploy. The sound equipment kept failing. Men worked with frozen hands, knowing that German units were close enough to hear them breathing. On January 2, 1945, a German patrol stumbled onto one of their setup areas near Bitburg. The Ghost Army soldiers, artists and designers, most of whom had never fired their weapons in combat, found themselves in a running firefight through snow-covered forest. They held their position long enough to destroy the inflatable tanks and fake equipment, then retreated under cover of darkness. 3 men were wounded. The deception held. German intelligence never realized what they almost captured. By February 1945, as the Allies pushed into Germany itself, the Ghost Army's role began to shift. They were no longer just creating phantom divisions. They were now part of operational deception for the final push across the Rhine. Operation Viersen, March 1945.
the Ghost Army's most elaborate performance. The actual Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine at Wesel. To draw German attention away from the real crossing site, the Ghost Army staged a massive buildup 30 miles south, near Viersen. For 2 weeks, they created the illusion of an entire army preparing to cross. Hundreds of inflatable vehicles, round-the-clock radio traffic, sonic units playing recordings of bridge construction equipment, notional engineering units with fake pontoon boats. German reconnaissance flights reported the buildup. Wehrmacht commanders reinforced Viersen, pulling units from Wesel. On the night of March 23, 1945, the real Ninth Army crossed at Wesel against weakened opposition. The Ghost Army had pulled off its masterpiece. Sergeant Bill Blass, decades later, would recall standing on the western bank of the Rhine, watching the inflatable tanks being deflated for the last time. "We'd convinced them," he said, "an entire army that existed only on canvas and in radio signals. And they fell for it. They actually fell for it." But the war wasn't over. The Ghost Army continued operations into April as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany. They impersonated the 30th Infantry Division near the Ruhr. They created phantom armored units threatening Dresden. They staged fake river crossings that never happened. Each deception bought time, saved lives, kept German units looking in the wrong direction. By the end of April 1945, they had conducted 20 major operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They had impersonated more than 15 different divisions. They had deployed thousands of inflatable tanks, hundreds of fake artillery pieces, miles of dummy installations.
German intelligence files captured after the war showed just how effective they'd been. Maps marked with Ghost Army positions, intelligence reports describing units that never existed, orders redirecting forces to counter threats that were nothing but air and paint. The greatest trick they ever pulled was convincing the Third Reich that reality was whatever the Ghost Army said it was. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Ghost Army was stationed near Bavaria. They'd spent 14 months turning warfare into performance art. They'd lived in a twilight world where appearance was reality, where a well-placed inflatable tank carried more weight than actual armor, where the sound of recorded engines could redirect entire armies. And then it was over. They packed up their equipment. The inflatable tanks were deflated, rolled up, stored away. The sound trucks fell silent. The radio operators shut down their transmitters. Within months, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was deactivated. The men were sent home with strict orders: never discuss the unit, never reveal what they'd done, never mention the inflatable tanks or the sonic deceptions or any of it. As far as the U.S. military was concerned, the Ghost Army had never existed. The classification would last for 44 years. For more than 4 decades, the men who'd served in the Ghost Army went about their civilian lives carrying a secret they couldn't share. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the most influential abstract painters of the 20th century. His massive color-filled canvases hung in museums worldwide. But he never spoke publicly about inflating rubber tanks in the French countryside. Bill Blass built a fashion empire. His designs defined American elegance, but he couldn't tell anyone that his eye for proportion and deception had been honed on fake artillery positions.
Art Kane photographed Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, countless other icons. His images became cultural touchstones, but the most dramatic scenes he'd witnessed, German planes searching for phantom armies, remained locked away. They'd meet occasionally, the Ghost Army veterans, quiet dinners in New York or Chicago. They'd talk about the war, but carefully, vaguely, aware that waiters and strangers might overhear. Their wives and children knew they'd served, but not how, not really. It wasn't until 1985 that the U.S. Army declassified the Ghost Army's operations. Even then, the revelation was quiet. A few newspaper articles, some academic interest from military historians, but nothing like the attention given to infantry divisions or bomber groups. The Ghost Army remained largely forgotten, a footnote in military history. It took a new generation to resurrect their story. In 1996, a documentary filmmaker named Rick Beyer began researching the unit. He tracked down surviving veterans, now in their 70s and 80s. He found the declassified files. He pieced together the full scope of their operations. What emerged was astonishing. The Ghost Army had conducted more deceptions than any other unit in military history. Their success rate was nearly perfect. They'd contributed to major victories across the European theater, and they'd done it all without the recognition given to conventional units. Beyer's documentary, The Ghost Army, finally brought their story to a wider audience. The surviving veterans, now in their 90s, finally got to see their service acknowledged, finally got to talk openly about what they'd done. Jack Macy, the young designer from New York who'd thought the whole thing was a joke back in 1944, lived to age 92. Before he died in 2016, he gave dozens of interviews about the Ghost Army. "We saved lives," he said simply. Every German soldier looking for our fake tanks was a German soldier who wasn't shooting at real Americans. Every artillery shell wasted on our dummy positions was a shell that didn't kill anyone. That's what I'm proud of.
Ned Harris, the painter who'd applied fake mud to rubber tanks at 3 a.m., was asked how he felt about spending his war painting instead of fighting. He thought for a long moment. "I fought," he said finally, "just with different weapons." The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond their individual operations. They pioneered techniques that became standard in military deception. The use of inflatable decoys, refined by modern materials, is still employed by armies worldwide. Sonic deception and electronic warfare trace their lineage directly to the spook operators of the 23rd. But more than that, they proved something profound about the nature of warfare. They proved that perception can be as powerful as reality, that a well-executed illusion can achieve what brute force cannot, that creativity and intelligence, properly applied, can defeat overwhelming firepower. In an era when we tend to romanticize warfare as purely physical, Marines storming beaches, pilots dogfighting in the sky, tanks clashing in open fields, the Ghost Army reminds us that war is also psychological. It's about what the enemy thinks is true, and sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who can make the enemy see ghosts. In 2019, Congress passed legislation to award the Congressional Gold Medal to the Ghost Army. It was the highest civilian honor the United States could bestow. Only 19 veterans were still alive to receive it. They attended the ceremony in Washington, these old men who'd once been young artists playing soldier. They wore their medals and smiled for photographs and shook hands with generals who commanded forces unimaginable in 1944. But their eyes carried something else. The weight of knowing that for years, decades, no one believed them.
that their service had been too strange, too classified, too improbable to be real. And the satisfaction of finally being able to say, we were there, we did that, it mattered. Bernie Bluestein, one of the last Ghost Army veterans, was asked what he wanted people to remember about the unit. He was 95 years old. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. Remember that we were just kids, artists, designers, theater guys. We didn't know how to be soldiers, but we learned, and we used our talents, the things we were good at before the war, to fight the war. He paused. And remember that sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones where people die. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones where people don't die, because you tricked the enemy into looking somewhere else. Bernie Bluestein died in 2021 at age 96. He was one of the last. Today, the Ghost Army's equipment resides in museums. The inflatable tanks, carefully preserved, look like props from a Hollywood production. Visitors see them and smile, charmed by their absurdity. But those who look closer see something else. They see the weathering, the fake mud, the attention to detail that had to pass inspection from German reconnaissance pilots flying at 5,000 feet. They see the massive sonic equipment engineered to project sound for miles. They see the photographs of young men setting up these elaborate deceptions within earshot of enemy forces. And they understand this wasn't a game. This wasn't Hollywood. This was warfare at its most audacious, at its most creative, at its most human. Because ultimately, the Ghost Army's story is about human beings using human ingenuity to counter human violence. It's about turning the tools of creation, art, sound, performance into shields against destruction. It's about men who couldn't stop the war, but who could bend its arc just slightly away from tragedy. Somewhere in France, there's a field where inflatable tanks once stood in perfect formation. The grass has grown back. The tire tracks have faded. Nothing remains to mark what happened there. But in the German archives, there's a reconnaissance photo from June 1944. It shows dozens of American tanks, artillery positions, supply dumps. All of it phantom, all of it real enough to change history. The Ghost Army fought a war that existed in the space between truth and fiction. They turned enemies into an audience, and deception into victory. And for decades, no one knew they existed. That was perhaps the greatest deception of all. Now their story is told, their service recognized, their names remembered. But walk through any art museum, any gallery where mid-century American art hangs on pristine walls, and you might pass a painting by Ellsworth Kelly, a photograph by Kane, and you'll never know, unless you know the story, that the artist who created that work once spent his nights inflating rubber tanks in enemy territory, that the eye that composed that image once searched the sky for German fighters while pretending to be what he wasn't. The Ghost Army proved that warriors come in many forms. Some carry rifles, some carry brushes. All of them serve. The Germans never caught on, not really. Even after the war, even with all their intelligence files captured and analyzed, Nazi commanders struggled to understand how they'd been fooled so completely, how entire divisions have appeared and vanished like smoke, how their best reconnaissance had been systematically deceived, how 1,000 artists had defeated the Third Reich's intelligence apparatus. The answer was simple and impossibly complex. They made them believe. And in the end, that was enough. If this story moved you, if it made you remember the names time tried to erase, if it revealed a corner of World War II you never knew existed, subscribe and help us keep their legacy alive. Because some warriors won their battles without ever firing a shot. And their victories were no less real.